So recently I came across a couple of Twitter threads, one by Thowries and one by the Confession Dial, discussing how Ryan's dyspraxia is implemented in Doctor Who from their point of view as people who are physically disabled. I've linked both in the description and I'd like to draw more attention to them, because while there's been a lot of discussion on how Ryan's dyspraxia is handled in the show, it's the voices with a direct stake in the matter who should really be heard the loudest, as with discourse on any kind of representation. And it's interesting that while the implementation of Ryan's dyspraxia is a failure, it's not for the reasons you might first think. One of the more frequent mainstream complaints that comes up is that Ryan's dyspraxia quote-unquote arc is never built upon, as his disability is prominently introduced in the first episode, then only brought up again intermittently and inconsistently throughout the series. Now, if we think about Ryan's dyspraxia in terms of other forms of representation, it's pretty dumb expecting him to have an arc or it be developed upon to begin with. It's like introducing a gay character and expecting their entire character arc to revolve around being gay. Things like disabilities or sexual orientation are just one superficial facet of an individual, kind of like colour of hair or shoe size. They don't define us, and good representation remembers that. As for Ryan's dyspraxia being inconsistent, the Confession Dial explains how from his experience living with dyspraxia, that can actually be perfectly normal. Like someone can have difficulty with something as straightforward as using cutlery to eat food, but be able to do rock climbing or gymnastics just fine. And that may seem inconsistent and random, but that's dyspraxia. What both Thowries and the Confession Dial do take issue with, however, is the way Ryan's dyspraxia is introduced through him riding a bicycle. Not because there's anything wrong with someone with dyspraxia riding a bike, but because Ryan's motivation for doing this activity is never made clear. Does he want to ride a bike so he can go on rides with his mates? Is it because he has an interest in cycling as a hobby? The show never really gives us anything beyond him wanting to make his nan proud. So in other words, he's doing it for someone else, perhaps both literally and in a figurative sense. You see, I strongly suspect the real reason for Ryan riding a bike has a lot to do with something I momentarily touched on in the intro. The trouble with discourse on any marginalised group is that all too often the voices of those who are actually experiencing things and who have a direct stake in the subject matter are drowned out by the voices of those who, put simply, don't. This is bad for a number of reasons, but for one, it leads to the needs of that marginalised group being misrepresented or flat out misunderstood. I can't speak for those with physical disabilities, but as an autistic person, I can relate to this. For the longest time, all mainstream discussion of autism has been led by people who are neurotypical, and because of that has tended to centre on things like early intervention and finding a treatment or cure for autism, despite the fact that if you actually talk to most autistic adults, we don't want to be cured. We're quite happy just the way we are, and what we'd really like is for society to be more accommodating towards us. It's for this reason we have the saying, nothing about us without us, and that's a sentiment I increasingly try to keep in mind these days when talking about other marginalised groups as well. For instance, when we did the Owl House review, we discussed some issues surrounding LGBT representation, so I deliberately made sure to reference what LGBT creators I follow have to say on the topic and use that as the basis for my critique, kind of like how I'm doing here with dyspraxia. But it's the aforementioned ableist misconception that people with disabilities are in some way broken and need to be fixed that I believe is bleeding into Chibnall's writing here, and that's why he introduces Ryan's dyspraxia through him riding a bike, because what else would he be doing? It doesn't matter that riding a bike is not an essential activity, he's got to do whatever it takes to overcome that terrible disability so he can be more quote-unquote normal. Remember, he needs fixing, not society. Yeah, it's really quite uncomfortable when you lay it out like that. Now, do I think there's any malicious intent on Chris Chibnall's part with this portrayal? No, I don't. Do I think he's a hack trying to score cheap points for representation without putting the work in? Absolutely. And it's interesting how media with slogans like space for all that gesture toward diversity and inclusion being at the forefront so often fail in their stated objectives. Because when you break it down, those objectives are only surface level. It's all about the appearance of being inclusive as opposed to actually being inclusive. Now, a lesser critic might at this point go off on a tangent about virtue signalling, but I don't like to use that term because it's so often affiliated with bigotry, and as Jesse Gender points out, it usually carries some sort of implication that the virtues in question being signalled are the problem. And that's the thing, Chibnall is right to include a disabled disabled character in Doctor Who. It's just the way he went about doing it is wrong. Just like how he was right to introduce a gay supporting character but was wrong to kill them off 25 seconds later. And these are really basic errors. There are some people, and let's face it, by some people I mean straight white able-bodied cis men, because it nearly always is, who act like marginalised groups are being unreasonable by demanding representation be done properly, when in fact all we're really asking for is the bare minimum. I said earlier how Chibnall is not prepared to put the work in, but to be honest, it isn't even work. I guarantee if he'd spoken to any LGBTQ person for more than 5 minutes, they would have informed him that bury your gays is a thing that exists, and hey, you should probably not do that scene. Same with the dyspraxia stuff. You could fix that so easily just by giving Ryan a clear intrinsic motivation for wanting to ride a bike. Not to impress his nan or any other reason, just for himself. It's that easy, and that's why it is frustrating. Representation is not some cryptic puzzle that needs to be decoded. It can be done with the bare minimum of effort. All it takes is to listen. I'm Midnight, and I just lost my train of thought.